In 2018, the quiet town of Rosario fell under a chilling silence as word spread about the disappearance of Alejandro Gutierrez. Known for being reliable and calm, Alejandro, a truck driver, vanished without a trace while on one of his usual routes. His family and friends were baffled. How could a man who never strayed from his path simply go missing? Days later, his truck was found abandoned in a desolate parking lot, hazard lights still flashing. Inside, his personal belongings were all neatly in place, as if someone had left them in perfect order to avoid raising any suspicion. But authorities suspected that beneath this calm exterior lay something far darker. Clara Martinez was born and raised in Rosario, Argentina. At 32, she had spent her whole life in the same neighborhood, surrounded by gray streets and rows of similar-looking houses. From a young age, this small-town life instilled in her a deep sense of unease. As a child, she was quiet and obedient, excelling in school and keeping to herself. But as she grew older, she became increasingly restless, feeling trapped by the predictability around her. She longed for something more than her job at the local pharmacy and occasional gatherings with friends. Clara met Alejandro Gutierrez when she was 28. He was 5 years her senior, an assured, tall man with tanned skin and jet black hair. Alejandro worked as a truck driver, hauling goods across the country and spending long stretches on the road. They were introduced by a mutual friend, and initially, there was no hint of a serious relationship. Yet Clara saw in Alejandro a sense of calm and security, which felt like an escape from her constant craving for change. Within a year, they were married, and life settled into a familiar, steady rhythm. Thanks to Alejandro's lengthy roots and strong work ethic, he earned significantly more than many of his peers and managed to set aside a substantial amount in his bank accounts. Each month, he transferred a portion of his earnings into a dedicated savings account, dreaming of the day he and Clara could afford a larger home. They frequently discussed their plans for the future, a spacious house out in the countryside with a garden and a cozy living room where they could entertain friends and unwind after long days. These dreams felt increasingly attainable. Alejandro's savings continued to grow, and buying that home was no longer just a far-off fantasy, but a realistic goal within reach. However, this quiet life soon became stifling for Clara. Alejandro was a man of routine. He always returned home on time, never stayed out late, and avoided getting involved in others' issues. Their evenings were filled with silent television watching or wordless companionship. His predictability, which had once seemed like stability to Clara, gradually became a source of irritation. Increasingly, Clara found herself alone in their apartment, especially when Alejandro was off on another long-haul trip. She would get lost in her thoughts and daydreams, drifting further from reality with each passing day. Clara began seeking comfort online, a place where she could find everything she felt was missing in her life. She read stories of people leading double lives, became engrossed in crime news, and followed discussions of society's darker sides. Her interest quickly morphed into an obsession. She discovered online communities where people openly shared secret desires, detailed plans, and fantasies about living beyond the law. These discussions fascinated her, drawing her in like a magnet. Meanwhile, Alejandro continued with his usual life, unaware that his wife was sinking deeper into a world of fantasies that grew darker and more vivid by the day. He stayed as calm and dependable as ever, focusing on providing stability for their family, never realizing Clara had begun to exist in an entirely different world, a world where rules and order had lost their hold on her. Neighbors noticed changes in Clara. She grew quieter, avoided conversation, and no one could quite figure out what was going on in her mind. But Clara knew she no longer wanted to be the quiet wife waiting for her husband's return. She was searching for a way out, something that could break the endless cycle and allow her to feel the thrill she had always craved. That thrill, she saw, lay in danger, in pushing boundaries, in actions that would unnerve others. Her fantasies began to extend beyond the computer screen, and she started wanting more. She imagined what it might be like to be with someone who didn't abide by the rules. She longed to feel the adrenaline she'd read about in those stories, and she couldn't hold back anymore. Clara Martinez began spending more time outside their home. She was often seen around various spots in downtown Rosario, places where it was easy to blend in with the crowd. According to neighbors, she started showing up in bars and small gatherings in obscure parts of town. No one knew what she was up to, but her absence from home was becoming noticeable. Alejandro Gutierrez continued his job as a truck driver. His work often took him away on long trips, sometimes for several days at a time. His routine involved early departures and late-night returns, a schedule he had grown accustomed to over the years. In late June, Alejandro set out on another long-haul job, planning to return home in 3 days. It was a routine assignment, delivering a shipment from Rosario to Cordoba and back. However, on the evening he was supposed to return, his truck never appeared in the driveway. He also hadn't made any calls. Soon after, Clara reported her husband as missing to the authorities. She explained that he had last called her the day before he was due back. Their conversation was normal. He mentioned the delivery was complete and he was on his way back. When Alejandro Gutierrez didn't come home from his trip, his family immediately knew something was wrong. Known for being dependable, Alejandro always let them know if he'd be late, and he had never gone missing in all his years of work. His mother, Maria Gutierrez, clutched her phone, dialing his number over and over, hoping to hear his voice. Each unanswered ring, each dropped call, felt like torment. She prayed it was just a signal issue, that he'd finally pick up and say everything was fine. But there was only silence. The police launched an investigation, starting by contacting Alejandro's employer to confirm his route and trip schedule. The company confirmed the delivery had been completed on time, but no one had seen the driver on his return journey. They checked the route, but found no signs of accidents or any other incidents along the way. This raised suspicions, and a task force was sent to Cordoba to investigate what could have happened. Alejandro's family was beside themselves, working with law enforcement around the clock, calling hospitals, and monitoring the news for any updates. Each day, their hope waned, but they refused to believe the worst. Clara, Alejandro's wife, portrayed herself as a concerned spouse, attempting to act the part of a worried partner. Yet those who knew her well couldn't help but notice odd details. Her expression remained unusually calm, and her responses to questions sounded rehearsed. But at the time, no one could have imagined the role she might have been playing in this entire ordeal. 2 days after Alejandro went missing, his truck was found. The vehicle had been abandoned in a deserted parking lot near a highway. There were no visible signs of damage, but it appeared as though someone had deliberately left it there. Inside the cab, officers discovered Alejandro's personal belongings, including his phone and wallet. This seemed strange. If it had been a robbery, they would expect money or documents to be missing, yet everything was untouched. The police also recovered the truck's navigation device, which showed his last route, a direct line from Cordoba to Rosario with no apparent detours. The investigation quickly focused on finding any witnesses who might have seen Alejandro's truck or Alejandro himself in the days leading up to his disappearance. Authorities conducted interviews, but no one recalled anything unusual. Meanwhile, Clara continued providing statements to the police. She described their life as calm and free from conflict, yet some of her answers raised red flags for investigators. Her demeanor was calm, almost too confident, which struck them as odd. It wasn't long before police discovered that Clara had recently been spending extensive time online, chatting with unknown individuals on forums and social media, which further piqued their interest. Investigators began examining her phone records and online activity. Several intriguing details emerged. In particular, Clara had been exchanging messages with a user named El Lobo Negro just weeks before Alejandro's disappearance. These messages were encrypted and sent through a messaging app primarily used for anonymous communication. This revelation marked a turning point, leading investigators to suspect that Alejandro's disappearance might not have been random. The truck itself also posed some curious questions. There were no signs of struggle, but forensic teams noted that the cab was meticulously cleaned. This level of tidiness seemed unusual for someone who'd just completed a long trip. Even the neatest drivers typically leave small traces, like wrappers or empty water bottles. The cargo area was untouched, as if no one had opened it after the delivery. This led investigators to believe that someone other than Alejandro may have been driving the truck on its final journey. A critical lead came from surveillance footage near a section of the highway where Alejandro's truck vanished from view. The video showed the vehicle turning onto a secluded dirt road that led to an abandoned farm. Police searched the location, but found nothing. The place appeared to have been vacant for years, with no signs of recent activity. Yet the fact that the truck had deviated off the highway raised significant suspicions. As the investigation progressed, suspicions surrounding Clara only grew. Detectives continued probing her social connections, identifying several individuals she'd been in contact with, some of whom had criminal records, adding new depth to her life outside the home. Information about El Lobo Negro remained scarce, but it was clear that this individual knew more about Clara's plans than anyone else. So far, all attempts to locate Alejandro or even understand what happened to him had turned up empty. The disappearance of his truck seemed more like a carefully orchestrated act than a random event. Every detail pointed towards something much more serious than a mere missing persons case. Investigators began focusing on theories involving criminal activity and were preparing to question Clara more aggressively, though they lacked concrete evidence of her direct involvement. The investigation into Alejandro Gutierrez's disappearance took a significant turn when detectives obtained cell tower data showing his phone's movement along a route that diverged from his planned trip. The last signal was detected in an area off the main highway on a deserted road rarely used by truckers. This raised serious suspicions and became a critical lead for further action. Police organized a search in the area, meticulously combing through nearby land. Soon, they found tire tracks matching Alejandro's truck model, leading them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. From the outside, the building appeared to be an empty, long-abandoned structure, but investigators noticed fresh tire marks and boot prints, indicating recent human activity. Inside the warehouse, officers made grim discoveries. They found a large red cloth on the floor, similar to a tarp, stained with dark spots that appeared to be blood. Police collected it for analysis and also located several plastic containers that smelled like gasoline or something similar. These findings intensified suspicions that the site may have been used to prepare for or conceal something serious. Forensic analysis soon confirmed that the stains on the cloth were indeed blood, and it matched Alejandro's. This breakthrough made the investigation more urgent and led detectives to focus on the possibility of a violent crime. At the same time, police began gathering witness statements, reaching out to Alejandro's friends and co-workers to reconstruct his last days before he vanished. Meanwhile, detectives continued monitoring Clara's bank accounts and devices. On one of her social media accounts, they discovered exchanges with a user named El Lobo Negro. Their conversations were carefully worded, but fragments of their discussions hinted at more than a friendly chat. Some messages appeared to be encrypted, containing references to meetings and transactions that raised suspicions. Investigators began to suspect that Clara might be involved in illegal activities. As investigators dug deeper into the messages, it became clear that El Lobo Negro had access to specific details about Alejandro's routes. In one of the exchanges, he mentioned a time and location that matched Alejandro's last registered trip. Police suspected this was no coincidence and submitted formal requests to uncover the identity behind the alias. Meanwhile, the pressure on Clara intensified. She continued to insist she had no knowledge of her husband's whereabouts and was not connected to his disappearance. Her story remained consistent, but detectives noticed subtle discrepancies. During interrogations, they repeatedly circled back to details she seemed intent on glossing over. Clara maintained her composure, yet it became evident that her version of events wasn't aligning with the facts investigators were uncovering. A few days later, the police received another unexpected lead. A witness who worked at a gas station near where Alejandro's truck was found remembered seeing the vehicle shortly before it vanished. He reported that a man was driving, but a woman sat beside him who matched Clara's description. This statement significantly shifted the investigation, as it now suggested Clara might have been in the truck that night. Investigators turned their attention to the financial records of the Gutierrez family. They soon uncovered a series of unusual transactions. In the months leading up to Alejandro's disappearance, Clara had transferred large sums of money to accounts registered under fictitious names. These funds were then moved into anonymous wallets, making them challenging to trace. This method is commonly used to conceal illicit income or pay for services off the grid, which attracted the attention of financial experts working with law enforcement. During one of Clara's interrogations, investigators presented her with photos of the warehouse and the results of blood analysis on the tarp they had found. Clara tried to keep her composure, but it was clear her nerves were fraying. She continued to insist that she didn't know what had happened to her husband. Detectives decided to ramp up the pressure, showing her additional evidence, though they hadn't yet obtained a confession. Meanwhile, efforts to identify El Lobo Negro were ongoing. Within days, investigators traced the account to a user on a popular forum in the dark web. It led them to Diego Pereira, a man previously convicted of fraud and theft. He was familiar to law enforcement, though he hadn't been on their radar for some time. This time, the trail led directly back to him, and soon after, Diego was arrested for questioning. During his interrogation, Diego initially refused to cooperate, but after several hours, he changed his approach. He admitted to messaging Clara, but denied involvement in her activities. However, his phone records and GPS data showed he was near the abandoned warehouse on the day Alejandro went missing. Investigators began forming a theory that Clara and Diego may have been conspiring to remove Alejandro for personal gain. But at this stage, they still lacked solid proof. Meanwhile, investigators revisited the issue of the gasoline containers found at the warehouse. Forensic experts discovered fingerprints on the caps that matched Diego's, further linking him to the scene. Despite this, crucial questions remained. Where was Alejandro now, and what exactly had happened after his last call to his wife? Police continued gathering evidence, inching closer to the truth. Clara and Diego remained the primary suspects, but without a confession or a decisive witness, closing the case was challenging. Investigators sensed they were close, but knew one misstep could jeopardize their chance of solving it. The case took a breakthrough turn when one of Diego Pereira's cellmates reported that Diego had boasted about his involvement in Alejandro's disappearance, hinting that the problem was taken care of through a well-devised plan. This information prompted police to conduct a second search of the warehouse, where traces of blood had previously been found. With more advanced equipment, investigators meticulously scanned every corner of the warehouse and uncovered a sealed-off room hidden behind an old brick wall. After breaking through, they found a neglected space littered with remnants of tarps soaked in chemicals, empty containers, and torn pieces of clothing. In one corner lay severely damaged organic remains. Forensic specialists quickly identified them as human and soon confirmed they were the remains of Alejandro Gutierrez. The autopsy determined he had been deceased for several weeks. These findings became pivotal in cracking the case. Detectives called Diego in for another interrogation and offered a reduced sentence in exchange for a full confession and cooperation. Diego agreed and disclosed the details of the plot he and Clara had devised months prior. According to him, the plan began when Clara approached him, offering a significant sum of money if he helped her deal with her husband. She wanted access to Alejandro's bank accounts and sought an end to a marriage she no longer found beneficial. Clara crafted a scenario meant to mimic a kidnapping and subsequent disappearance to avoid suspicion. On the day Alejandro disappeared, as he was driving back home from Cordoba, Clara set out to intercept him. She sent him a message ahead of time, asking for help and claiming her car had broken down. Alejandro, being the caring husband, immediately changed his route and headed to the location Clara described, a secluded spot near the warehouses. When Alejandro arrived, he saw Clara standing by her car with the hood up. He got out of his truck to help, but as he approached, Diego suddenly appeared from behind the car. Holding a metal bar, Diego struck Alejandro from behind, landing a blow to the back of his head. The impact was so forceful that Alejandro collapsed, losing consciousness. Diego struck him several more times to ensure he wouldn't get up, and with Clara's help, moved his body into the trunk of her car. They transported him to the warehouse they had prepared in advance. There, Diego and Clara restrained Alejandro to keep him immobilized. As he began to regain consciousness, Diego used a knife they had previously purchased, delivering several strikes to Alejandro's chest. The act was brutal and ruthless. They moved quickly, knowing they had to dispose of the body before it could tie them to the crime. Once it was clear Alejandro had passed, they wrapped his body in a tarp to contain the blood and began the process of covering their tracks. Initially, Diego and Clara planned to use chemicals to dissolve the remains. They had brought several containers of acid to the warehouse ahead of time, but the process proved more challenging than they anticipated, and they were unable to fully eliminate the body. Instead, they dismembered the remains, hiding them in different corners of the warehouse, covering them with debris and construction waste, hoping it would be enough to prevent discovery. Their original plan was to get rid of all evidence, but realizing they were running out of time, they decided to leave things as they were, intending to clean up more thoroughly later. After finishing with Alejandro's body, Clara and Diego returned to his truck, parked nearby. Diego got behind the wheel, while Clara took the passenger seat, hoping to avoid suspicion if anyone saw the truck on the road. They drove it to an isolated parking lot along a rarely used road. Along the way, they made a stop at a gas station to double-check and clean out the truck without drawing attention. Here, a witness, a gas station attendant, saw them and later recalled the woman in the passenger seat and the man driving. This testimony would later become a key piece of evidence in the investigation. When they arrived at the deserted parking lot they had chosen, Diego left Alejandro's truck with its hazard lights on, making it look as if the driver had just stepped away temporarily. Before leaving the cab, they carefully wiped down the steering wheel, door handles, and other surfaces where fingerprints might have been, leaving Alejandro's personal items in place to create the impression of a routine trip. After handling the grim details, Clara returned home and began acting the part of a worried wife. She made calls to Alejandro, left messages, and the following day went to the police to report him missing. Her behavior was meant to deflect suspicion from herself, but detectives noticed inconsistencies in her statements. Police began reviewing her phone records and found that she had been texting with Diego on the day Alejandro went missing. Surveillance cameras also captured her car on a route she wouldn't typically take. When confronted with this evidence, Clara continued to deny any involvement, insisting that she was merely concerned for her husband and that her encounter with Diego was purely coincidental. However, further analysis of financial records revealed large transfers from her accounts to anonymous bank accounts tied to Diego, which only strengthened the case against her. During the trial, prosecutors presented a comprehensive timeline, supported by witness testimony, surveillance footage, financial transactions, and Diego's confession. They demonstrated that Clara was the mastermind behind the plot leading to Alejandro's tragic end. She had conceived the plan, funded it, and coordinated Diego's actions to stage Alejandro's disappearance. Diego carried out her instructions, but his confession laid bare the full details and clarified each person's role. In the courtroom, Alejandro's family and loved ones looked on at the defendants with expressions of anger and heartbreak. Alejandro's mother, Maria, sat with her hands clenched, tears welling up in her eyes. She tried to look straight ahead, but her gaze kept faltering, as if afraid to fully confront the truth. Each time the prosecutor recounted the details of what had happened to her son, her face twisted in pain she couldn't hide. Alejandro's sister, Rosa, couldn't contain her sobs as the prosecutor read the details of the plot orchestrated by Clara and Diego. The prosecution's words were heavy and harrowing. As the prosecutor laid out the events, detailing how Clara manipulated and schemed to eliminate her husband, her family's faces twisted in horror. They struggled to believe that a woman they thought they knew could be capable of such cold-hearted betrayal. Their minds flashed back to moments when Clara had sat beside them, pretending to share in their grief, and the realization shattered their hearts. The court sentenced Clara Martinez to life in prison without the possibility of parole for orchestrating the crime, conspiracy, and destruction of evidence. Diego Pereira, who cooperated with the investigation and provided testimony, received a 25-year sentence with a possibility for reduced time based on behavior. The judge noted that his cooperation was essential in exposing and holding the primary perpetrator accountable, though it did not absolve him of responsibility for his role in the crime. The tragic story of Alejandro Gutierrez's death, shook Argentina, serving as a sobering reminder of the lengths some people will go to for financial gain and self-interest. The case made headlines nationwide, with townspeople discussing it long after the trial ended. This dark tale illustrated how quickly lives can unravel when greed and calculated malice overpower human decency.